Good afternoon, folks, and welcome along to today's webinar. My name is Jamie, and I'll be running the session today, along with my colleague Graham, who is not listed on the screen because he made a last-minute addition, but he is here with us, and he'll be in the chat box to answer any questions that you might have today. Steve Beattie might also join us later on as well. Steve is another tutor assessor and is one of our associate regional trainers and verifiers who has been through the verification process already. So Steve might help us to answer questions later on as well. This webinar is all about verification, internal verification, external verification, and certification. And it should hopefully last about 30 minutes, and you will leave feeling confident about how to go through the process with your young STEM leaders as they reach the end of the programme. Just a note that we have, I'm aware that some of you might be continuing delivering Young STEM Leader during lockdown. Some of you might have paused. There's lots of guidance on the ways that you can be running the award, things that your young STEM leaders can be doing, and kind of various other information about using the website and things like that on our website. It pops up as a little kind of orange bar at the bottom like that, and you just click guidance for centre closures, click find out more, and there's a whole host of questions there that will be answered for you. So we're here to answer your questions, but if you have any more, you can always head there after the session. So as I said, today's session is going to cover three things, mainly internal verification, certification, and external verification. And this is all for the non-formal levels of the program, so YSL2, YSL3, and YSL4. All of the information that I will be covering today is detailed in our quality assurance verification and certification policy. You can find that on the resources section of the website. If you have any questions at all today during the session, you can pop them in the chat box, or you can wait until I've finished speaking after about 25 minutes, and you can raise your hand and unmute your mic, and I will get to your question then, whichever works best for you. And I'm going to try not to keep you too long, so let's just get started with the webinar. But before we do, we've asked some of our young STEM leaders to prepare a bit of a guide on how to do internal and external verification and certification. This is very slightly out of date, and I will explain why, because there's been some changes to the non-formal process. But here are the young STEM leaders from St. Mark's Primary School talking about the verification process. I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, we are the young STEM leaders of St. Mark's Primary School, and we are here to talk to you about verification.
We're going to let Graham and Jamie, the young STEM leader program projecting, do this bit, but we thought we'd step in and give them some help.
It's not that they are boring or that they don't know what they're talking about. We just thought you'd like to hear it from some young STEM leaders.
Everything you know about quality assurance is in the policy, which you should all have access to.
Quality assurance is so important, and it makes sure that everyone is delivering young STEM leader program to the same high standards as themselves.
When at or near the start of the program, it's important to the tutor assessor and the internal verifier. Remember, the internal verifier must be a trained tutor assessor. You should then choose which young STEM leaders' logs will be in your sample batch for verification.
The policy gives you guidance on this.
If you're doing a formal level of the Young STEM Leader program, now's the time to fill in section 1 of the IV form.
If you're doing non-formal levels, you don't need to use the IV1 form, but do keep a record of your verification progress.
For formal levels, the internal verifier needs to observe the tutor assessor delivering the program. This can be a quick drop into a class or club, or even joining the online activity they might be doing.
This isn't needed for non-formal levels, but it's good to practice if you do. The internal verifier should use the quality assurance checklist when they observe the group.
You'll find that in the policy too.
For every level of the program, the internal verifier must look over their sample batch logs and use the quality assurance checklist. Online logs can be shared between the tutor assessor and the internal verifier using the Tutor Access button on your dashboard. If you are using hard copies of the log, just hand the sample batch over to the internal verifier.
Remember to wash your hands.
Some internal verifiers choose to observe the group in action and check the sample batch logs at the same time.
That's a good idea if you can, but don't worry if you can't.
Formal level, the rest of the IV1 form can be filled in.
For non-formal, the internal verifier and tutor assessor just need to agree the logs have been processed correctly. So that's the internal verification process complete. What's next?
When you finish the program and the young STEM leaders have completed their logs, it's certificate time.
Email the project team itself to let them know you've completed the program and you've completed the internal verification too.
You might be chosen for external verification at that stage. This is where an extra quality assurance check is carried out by the project team.
Don't worry though, this is also really straightforward. And when all of this is done, your young STEM leaders will get their certificates.
There's just one last thing to do at this point.
Celebrate the amazing achievements you and your young STEM leaders have made!
Thank you very much to our contributors from St Marnock's Primary School. A fantastic group of young people explaining how the process of verification works. There are some changes which that are now in place from when that video was made just before Christmas, but I'll talk you through those just now. The first thing I'd like to talk to you about this afternoon is internal verification. This is a process that you as a tutor assessor will need to complete. Every single tutor assessor will need to complete before they request certification of the young STEM leaders. It's a very straightforward internal quality assurance check, really, between you and your internal verifier. So the internal verification is a two-way process between you, the tutor assessor, and another trained tutor assessor who we call the internal verifier. So as a tutor assessor, you will be assessing your young STEM leaders' logs and kind of approving all of their evidence. Once they've reached the end of their logs, the end of the award and have their logs complete, you will share a sample batch of your logs with the internal verifier. And you will also complete the relevant section of what we call the declaration form. So that's the form that you have to fill in that is a record of your internal verification, if you like, but it is very straightforward, and please don't panic about that. When the internal verifier looks over the sample batch logs, they also have to complete a small part of that declaration form as well. Once the declaration form is complete, the tutor assessor, you can then request certification for your young STEM leaders if necessary. The internal verifier can be a colleague, a tutor assessor within your own centre, or it can be a tutor assessor from another centre. We can help you, put you in touch with someone else who doesn't have an internal verifier, and you can kind of buddy up and internally verify each other. That word internal is a slight misnomer. You can still internally verify someone even if they're not in your own centre. And that's really the process in a nutshell. I'll talk to you a bit about sample batch and what that means. So we kind of expect about 20% of your young STEM leaders to be in that sample batch. So for example, if you had 20 young STEM leaders, we'd expect 4 of those young STEM leaders logs to be reviewed by your internal verifier as part of that internal verification process. And there's some guidance on that in the policy documents. We encourage tutor assessors to choose a wide variety of ability levels within that sample batch cohort. So, you're going to choose your high and your low ability young STEM leaders to give a true representative example of what your cohort looks like. And it is possible to internally verify a whole cohort at once, but certificate separately. So for example, if you had 20 young STEM leaders, 10 of them had completed the program, and you wanted to get them certificated, for example, before the February break, and 10 of them were kind of making their way through, but they weren't ready for certification yet. That's absolutely fine. You can still internally verify the whole batch of young STEM leaders and certificate them separately. And that just means you wouldn't have to do internal verification for a second time when your second batch of young STEM leaders is ready for certification. In order to kind of, for your internal verifier to look over these logs, you obviously need to share the logs with them. You can do that by giving them paper copies of the log or making photocopies, taking screenshots, scanning the logs and sending them. If the logs are being completed online, you can use a function on the Tutor Assessor dashboard called Tutor Access to give another Tutor Assessor access to those logs, or you might be using a combination of those things. So for example, if some of it is completed on paper, but there's also some digital photos, you might put it all in a OneDrive or something like that and share it with them directly. The tutor access is really straightforward to do on your Tutor Assessor dashboard. You just click Tutor Access, which is next to My YSLs. You type in the name of the tutor assessor you'd like to share your young STEM leaders with and click Send Request. That request will appear in the same portion of the website for them, so they'll have to go into Tutor Access and access it that way, and they can then see all of your young STEM leaders logs. So you just have to guide them to the logs of your sample batch, and they will review them that way. And then once they've got access to the sample batch, your internal verifier will be completing their part of the declaration form. But as you can see, I've highlighted in yellow on the declaration form the parts that are completed by you as a tutor assessor, and in blue, the parts that are completed by the internal verifier. So there's really not a lot of paperwork that the internal verifier has to do to complete IV at the non-formal levels, but of course they do have to be looking over the logs, comparing those to the relevant support notes, and looking over the quality assurance checklist that is in the quality assurance verification and certification policy. So for example, if you had a cohort of YSL2s and I was your internal verifier, I would be checking over your sample batch logs against the YSL2 support notes, making sure that all of the evidence is there and that everything is in good shape. And I'd also be looking over the quality assurance checklist to make sure that all of that had been satisfied. So most of what's in the declaration form is just details about who your sample batch is. And then there's a couple of declaration questions relating to you declaring that young STEM leaders have completed the log or provided alternative evidence that you have done internal verification. And the internal verifier has two additional points here. One, that the Young STEM Leader program is being delivered to the standards set out in the support notes, and two, that they agree with the assessment decisions that you have made. Basically, they agree that the logs are to the acceptable standard and are ready to be submitted for certification. If there's anything that you need to clarify or anything that's come up in that process that maybe has been changed or amended, you or the internal verifier would write that in the matters arising and comments box at the bottom. So for example, if the internal verifier suggests some extra evidence be provided for one young STEM leader, that would be where you would put it. Or if there's something that you want to clarify to externally for a later date, young STEM leader X has completed their log on paper, online, and on the online platform, so it's disjointed. You might want to write that in there as well. So just enough to kind of clarify the decisions you're making and anything extra that you think that anyone reviewing these logs would need to know. And that should hopefully be a very straightforward process and quite quick to do. And once you've completed internal verification, you're then ready to request certificates from us. So what happens is you've completed your declaration form, you're ready to get the certification going ahead. You just send an email attaching that completed declaration form to youngstemleader@sark.scot. That's the kind of standard young STEM leader email. You don't need to send us your logs. We don't need to see that at this stage. And we only really need to see that declaration form. It's internally assessed. So there's no kind of external assessment that goes on at this stage. We will then send you a spreadsheet that looks like that at the bottom. That is a secure spreadsheet. It'll be password protected and you'll get the password sent in a separate email address, and you will have to fill in some details about your young STEM leaders. Regardless of whether they completed it on paper or online, you still need to complete this digital spreadsheet. So we ask for their name, their sex, their date of birth, and whichever young STEM leader level they are working at. And there's then a short declaration part there where you just have to tick these 3 boxes saying that all logs are complete, all the authenticity statements are complete, and the internal verification and declaration form is complete, just as a kind of final checklist for you. You then attach that on an email back to us, and we will get the certificates produced and again securely sent to you within 2 weeks, usually within 2 weeks. That'll come straight back to you. And that is the process of internal verification and certification. And hopefully it's fairly straightforward. We have the 2 week turnaround thing is pretty standard, but it may be slightly delayed. But we really have tried to streamline this process as much as possible and minimize the impact on workload to you as a tutor assessor. Now, at the certification stage, for many tutor assessors, we will just say, yes, thank you for your declaration form and for your data request spreadsheet. We will certificate your young STEM leaders in 2 weeks. But for some tutor assessors, we will need to go through a process of external verification. This happens between the tutor assessor, so you, and an external verifier, which is myself or one of my colleagues at CERC. So at the stage where you, the tutor assessor, request certification, we will then ask if you are being selected for external verification to provide access to us at CERC to your sample batch logs, whether that's by post or email or through the online platform. It will then be our job, or one of my colleagues' jobs, to review the sample batch logs against the support notes, similar to the way your internal verifier did, review that declaration form, and then complete an EV1, which is an external verification form, and we will then deliver that result to you by email. We select centres at random, usually at random. We have, because it's a new award, we are aiming to externally verify quite a large number of centres, but usually they're selected at random. You might also be selected based on a previous external verification result. For example, if last year you had a not accepted external verification result, we would come back to you a second year. Or if you have a particularly large or new cohort, for example, if you have 200 young STEM leaders, it's very likely that you will be accepted, selected for external verification, which I'm sure won't come as a surprise. You'll be notified by email at certification, and you'll at that stage probably have sent your declaration form to us already. So the only other thing that we will need is to have access to your logs if you're selected for external verification, and you can do that by post. We pay for the post, via email or via the online platform, whichever is most suitable to you. The logs will then be reviewed by a member of CERC staff, myself, Graham, or one of our 17 associate regional trainers and verifiers who are across the country, and they will then deliver a result to you. This is all detailed in the quality assurance verification and certification policy, but there are 3 results. There are 2 results that are positive, the accepted and accepted with recommendations. The accepted result basically means that there's no additional action required, that you're showing good practice and delivering the award to the acceptable standards. Accepted with recommendations usually means that there is something that we would like you to do in future to improve the practice or to improve the quality of the submission. And not accepted means that you must take action that we will specify prior to getting certificates for your young STEM leaders. We will then ask the next year or the next submission, we will externally verify you again, and we may impose sanctions on you as well. And those sanctions are detailed in the quality assurance verification and certification policy. I would expect that most of our submissions are accepted. We've been completing external verification this year for a number of centres, and most of it's gone through, or all of it actually has gone through very positively. So please don't let this put you off or scare you. It's a very straightforward process, and it's part of quality assurance for many other awards. So, and I hope that it can be a smooth process for you if you do get accepted, selected for external verification. So just to summarize the kind of process of verification and certification, when all or most of your young STEM leaders have completed their logs, you will then go through the process of internal verification with a colleague or with another tutor assessor from a different centre, and we can help put you in touch. Once internal verification is complete, you will then request certification by attaching your declaration form to an email to youngstemleader@cerc.scot. At that stage, we will either get going and award you your certificates within 2 weeks, or we will select you for external verification, where you have to go through that process I just described by giving us access to your sample batch logs, and we will deliver that result. And if that result is accepted, then we can issue the certificate straight away. If it's not accepted, then we will describe the actions that you will need to do to get those awards accepted for certification. Okay, so I think Steve has joined us now, and Steve is one of our tutor assessors who's been delivering the programme for 2 years at Hayshead Primary School in Angus. And Steve is also an associate regional trainer and verifier who has just been through, who is one of our staff at SARC, so I should say, and he has just been through the internal and external verification process himself. So he is very experienced in the process of verification. I don't know, Steve, if you want to just talk briefly about your experience of the process and any kind of tips for other tutor assessors.
I suppose how Jamie explained it and how easy it is, it really has been like that. The process of getting our young STEM leaders up to speed and getting through to the certification stage, that was probably the most arduous out of everything. I would recommend, like Jamie has said, about your tutor assessor. If you can get other people in your own school to do the training for tutor assessing, then it's going to be much easier whenever it comes to that internal verification stage as well. And try and sell it to members of your staff as well. You know, the training is going to be beneficial for your school in terms of sustainability as well. If you move on, you'll be able to carry that forward as well. I managed to persuade one of the teachers in our school to do it, and whenever it came to the internal verification in terms of the sample batches, again, like Jamie said, it is very, very easy. We just put 9 through, but there was only 3 that required to be looked at. So again, it was just a matter of saying, look, you need to look at these, really give as much detail as you can to make sure that we've gone through the process in the right way. And it was really, really easy for them. And then surprisingly enough, as Jamie said, everybody is essentially getting externally verified just now. So it wasn't a surprise, and that was a very, very helpful phase. And it was just yeah, you have done this, and maybe for next time, I think if we have linking the online platform to be enabled verification right up and fill in forms, doing it that way, then I would understand.
Great, thanks, Steve.
Hello?
I just turned off your video at the end there, so that was me that did that because I think we're having some issues with your sound quality, but hopefully everyone understood that. And if you've got any questions for Steve, you can pop them in the chat box.
Jamie, Jamie, can I just apologise? The weather around here is absolutely horrific.
All right.
I do apologise. That might have something to do with the internet.
It's much better now with your camera off, actually. So that's a good tip. I hear you loud and clear.
To be fair.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Steve. So if anyone has any questions or thoughts or comments or feelings about internal or external verification or the certification process, please type your questions into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute your mic and ask the questions that way, and Steve, myself or Graham will be able to help you answer those.